Welcome everybody to the second panel of today and panel of our first ever conference at DiGRA India. I am Maurito. I'm currently pursuing Masters in Presidency University, Kolkata under English in Literature. I'll be the chair for this panel, and which is about postcolonialism, India, and games. And so we have a lovely lineup for the second and the final panel. We will be starting this panel with Neil Nagwekar with his paper on the postcolonial analysis of Indians in Age of Empires 2. Neil Nagwekar, him, is a recently graduated student in English literature from FLU, Hyderabad. He has been published with Café de Censors, EHC Amsterdam, Midday National Center for Performing Arts, St. Xavier's Mumbai, Tell Me Your Story, University of Winchester, and Yearly Shakespeare. We will be handing over the screen to Neil Nagwekar.
Thank you for the lovely presentation, for the lovely introduction, Arithro. I hope everyone can see the presentation right now.
Yes, it's visible.
All right. So as mentioned, the topic for this talk is on the post-colonial analysis of Indians in Age of Empires 2. This is quite a lengthy argument with a lot of moving parts. I'm going to need every second of my 20 minutes. I have 3:06 p.m. right now. Without further ado, I'll just get into it. Just stop me in between if I am too quick or not audible. All right, let's begin. All right. It is a truth universally acknowledged that of the 39 playable civilizations in Age of Empires 2 definitive edition, the Indians are far from the most popular. EOE stats rank them with the 5th least play rate among global gamers. Spirit of the Law demonstrates how, when it comes to Indians, their archery and infantry are without specialty, their siege have little flexibility, their ships are among the worst in the game, their tech tree leaves a lot to be desired, their defenses are average, and their unique units do not compare to other civilizations. The Viper, a professional, says that the developers in an update, I'm quoting him, did nerf Indians for some reason in a very bad way. And he also says that they are, quote, definitely awkward to play with. Indians excel in villager bonuses, eco boosts, and general late game advantage. However, other civilizations like Persians, Spanish, France, etc. also have similar advantages and are statistically much more popular than the former. While the unpopularity and general mistrust for Indians in EOE2 discourse is apparent, the fact that they are ordinary and the possibility that inattentiveness from developers led to an undercooked civilization is one that enters the domain of post-colonial criticism. Now, before we move on, a regulative analysis of the words colonialism and the word post-colonial is necessary before continuing. You can see some thoughts on the words post or post-colonial or post-colonial influence by Catherine Nash, Sybil Lambs, and Shauvixon. All of these descriptions do not directly define what colonialism itself means because the implication is rather clear. Colonialism, as is commonly known, pertains to the actions and consequences of the, say, 5 or 7 centuries, where specifically European nations systematically ruled over and economically exploited several countries, thereby modifying entire cultures, attitudes, economies, etc. So what separates colonialism from, say, war in general is that the latter pertains to a straightforward conflict, straightforward conquest, a phenomena that has existed throughout human history. Post-colonial criticism and colonialism in general, on the other hand, attains its provenance and ontology when it concerns a colonizer or a colonized, former or present, in the historical sense of the term. This may seem like a rather obvious point to make, but bear it in mind, for it will be important later. Okay. Post-colonialism aside, there are several reasons to support the claim that Indians are misrepresented. Until 2016, they shared the same architecture design as Byzantines, Saracens, and Berbers. The Imperial Camel Rider is one of their unique units, but aside from the Rajputs and possibly in Gujarat, camel warfare was not a mainstay in medieval India. Horses were much more commonplace, which makes the elimination of knights from the civilization perplexing. Indian elephant archers are statistically among the worst elephant units in the game, which contrasts their immense historical importance among Cholas, Deccan Sultanates, Jats, Mauryas, and Mughals. It also seems to me a missed opportunity to not give Indian monasteries superior texts, given the vast influence of religion in India. This is also not to mention how the civilization itself is termed Indians, when in actuality it loosely portrays disparate kingdoms across several time spans. So to call such a diverse array of dynasties with one name is to lump the Britons, Franks, Teutons, Italians, etc. together as the Europeans. Now, the misrepresentation of any Oriental space in video games, not only Age of Empires, often becomes a trigger for its post-colonial criticism. Several examples in game studies support this assertion. Look at the quotes from George Albor, Witzisler, and Schowitzer. The latter two are more specific to Age of Empires, whereas the first one is a little more general. Very important to note that the aforementioned criticisms in this slide primarily relate to misrepresentation. However, post-colonial analysis of RTS video games like Age of Empires are not confined to this sole parameter. Indians in Age of Empires 2 are misrepresented, sure, but this paper will not only examine this misrepresentation in further detail, but it will also include these other parameters. So aside from misrepresentation, which is the first parameter, lack of accuracy, I have identified at least 3 more distinct parameters from lit review. The first one is basically misrepresentation. The other 3 I'll sort of explain as and when we get to them. The aim of the paper is to explore the 4 distinct parameters and analyze whether Indians and Age of Empires 2 quote unquote qualify most or all of these conditions. Of course, before I move on, it's fair for someone to wonder why qualifying any text for post-colonial analysis is even necessary. This is because a post-colonial criticism of any text is a grave charge sheet. It has implied and will imply at least one of several allegations: an insidious intent or prejudice by the creators of the text, a genuine yet problematic misunderstanding of history that is made manifest inside this text, a pollution of discourses which promote the fossilization or exoticization of Oriental spaces and peoples as ahistoric beings, an attempt to propagate colonialism in some covert fashion, or a suppression of subaltern third space voices, etc. Any any video game which is under serious purview of post-colonial criticism is reasonably assumed to be the culprit of at least one of these crimes or something similar. This is why for me, qualification is necessary. We're going to move on to the crux of the paper here. Before we explore these 4 parameters in detail, if anyone has any factual questions or clarifications about the argument so far, you're free to ask. I'll just have a sip of water and then we'll continue. All right, no questions. Let's get cracking. The first parameter pertains to misrepresentation or lack of accuracy in representation of Oriental spaces / peoples. On first glance, the Indians in Age of Empires 2 appear to be the poster boy for misrepresentation. Imperial camel riders, weak elephant units, absence of knights, homogenization of disparate kingdoms. The lengthy charges are already mentioned. In the interest of exhaustive analysis, it's important to list the few accuracies. Unique perks of Indians include 10% quicker gold mining and 5%, 10%, 15% cheaper villagers over time. This invariably increases the abundance of labor and gold and is an accurate parallel to medieval India. Indians are also a gunpowder civilization. Historian Iqtidar Khan have noted, I'm quoting Iqtidar here, except for Ottoman territories, in no other place was gunpowder artillery available in such abundance as the Mughal Empire. A few games between pros are accurate simulations of history with respect to medieval India. In a 1v1 matchup on a gold rush map between Hera and Bals, who are 2 pros, Hera played with Britons, Bals played with Indians. Bals' strategy was to use elephant archers, but he was shut out by Hera, who used monks to convert his unit. He held monopoly over gold and his superior infantry tech, and he used his superior infantry tech tree to eventually win with champions. So the monopoly of gold corresponds to the accrued capitalist wealth of the British. The champions roughly equate to the technologically superior military, and conversion, according to Schowitzer himself, is in a previous paper paralleled as, I'm quoting him, the conversion of the other to the more accessible European educated subject. Another game strategy offers another interesting counterfactual narrative. When the Viper defeated Hera with Indians, his strategy was what we call an extended brush, which means aggression from early ages, not giving the opponent the time to build their army. Hera used the same strategy when he won with Indians in a separate 1v1. This viable trust tactic, despite Indians ostensibly being a late game civ, is an interesting counterfactual trend and substantiated by the graph in the slide. India in real history never showed any quote early aggression towards colonial bodies and allowed them to build their armies. The Dutch, French, British, Portuguese did exactly the opposite. It appears then that the simulation that is AOE2, where early aggression is rewarded with victory, somewhat mirrors reality. Now, while these accuracies are sort of faithfully and almost compulsorily noted, the inaccuracies are too blatant to be ignored, and one may still argue that the latter, which is the inaccuracies, outweigh the former. However, even if it does, questions must be asked about whether misrepresentation is due to the sole othering of the Orient. Two facts denounce this notion. Firstly, several civilizations and histories have been misrepresented by AOE2, including colonial bodies. I quote from the game, which says, "The English have been in a slow retreat ever since the debacle at Harfleur." The preface to the Agincourt battle states, "Even though the English actually defeated the French here, Aztec Emperor Montezuma II submitted to Spanish conquistadors in reality, although in Age of Empires II, the gamer wins as Montezuma. William Wallace lost the Battle of Falkirk and was hung, drawn, and quartered by the English in real life. But in the game's tutorial, he leads the Scottish to victory." So there are several inaccuracies across civilizations and across storylines, regardless of whether they were once colonizing or colonized forces. There is nothing to suggest that Indians or any Oriental civilization for that matter are dramatically misrepresented in comparison to Occidental civilizations, dramatically being the operative word here. Note the fact that the three examples I just mentioned are also anti-colonial, which means that they contradict real history while also portraying side. This point is all but confirmed by AOE's creators Goodman, Sullivan, and Shelley, who say that right at the bottom. So, is it fair to employ a specifically post-colonial lens towards the misrepresentation of Indian history, when in fact most regions, regardless of their colonial status, have been blatantly misrepresented by developers who themselves state that the historical accuracy of Age of Empires 2 was never their focus? This does not appear to be latent Orientalism manifesting into a prejudicial view of West and East. It is the purposeful exoticization of most civilizations, no matter their colonial status, and a general preference to game mechanics over historical accuracy. This criticism is therefore flawed. The second parameter for post-colonial criticism is the privileging of a colonialist logic via counterfactual or alternative history. This pertains to the winning condition of the video game, as well as the instruments that aid. For example, in Age of Empires 2, reverse colonization is perfectly possible if a gamer controlling Indians, for example, conquers an opponent controlling Britons. The argument here is that this is no real transcendence from the colonialist logic. It is only a reversal of the expansionist logic that was, and I quote Savik's here, posited by real-life colonial powers in the first place. Now, the identification of this colonialist logic has been a consistent theme. Look at the quotes from Daniel Dugan and Sybil Long on the PPT to validate this. Again, on the face of it, Age of Empires 2 ticks several boxes. It has mini-maps, fogs of war, lines of sight, a reliance on exploration, emphasis on a production-based economy, and its victory conditions tend to be linked to conquest. But is this a colonialist logic, or is it just the general logic of war? Anya Lumba helps us out here. She has already identified the elements that distinguish colonialism from general conquest. European colonialism of the 50th century onward, she says, a very different phenomenon from earlier kingdoms, such as Rome or Egypt empires. Modern colonialism, and these are the keywords, restructured the economies of the latter, one, drew them into a complex relationship with their own, two, and ensured a flow of human and natural resources between colonized and colonial countries. This is three. Sorry, I didn't mention the third element in the slide. So, if Age of Empires 2 was focused on these factors, which is the restructuring of the opponent's economies, for example, then that would have been mirrored in, say, its diplomacy settings. There should have been a diplomacy setting where, for example, after civilization A conquers civilization B, the gamer of civilization B can continue managing their civilization only under conditions that they send resources, villagers, military, etc. to civilization A when A needs it, and also to submit to the sovereign reign of civilization A. There could also have been mechanics that allowed civilization B to protest for emancipation or independence. An example, let's say in Civilization 4, Civilization 4 incorporates a game mechanic where finished products in colonized America are sold to Europe. That is colonialist logic. But in Age of Empires 2, there is no restructuring of the opponent's economy. The focus, in fact, of Age of Empires 2 is either killing the enemy's king or population, allied victory, or wonder building. It is not on adapting the discursive, economical, or cultural mechanisms that forms the nuanced ontology of colonialist logic. In fact, the only mechanic for specifically colonialist logic is successfully implemented in EOE2 is through conversion by monks. But even this point is debatable due to the forceful conversions of rulers and subjects during Saxon Wars, Northern Crusades, the Islamic control of Spain, etc., during early and medieval ages. Moreover, this is only one example. It does not stand against several examples where colonialist logic is absent. One fact, the game is set in pre-colonial eras between 500 BC to 1500 ED. Another fact, civilizations are restricted to medieval weapons. Another fact, methods of administration that are somewhat comparable to, say, carrot stake, cash crop, or viceroy mechanics are absent. Another fact, all civilizations accrue resources the same way rather than one sort of parent colonizer sieve having 4 or 5 colonies feeding the beast. To conclude this point real quick, can the age-old lust for power and its effects on entire civilizations only be confined to colonialist logic? Colonialism, as previously identified by regulative analysis, relates to the 5th or 7th centuries pre-Renaissance Europe and the modern world that specifically concerned the domination of Europe upon Africa, Asia, America, and Australia. It does not concern, for example, the Roman Empire, the Mongolian Empire, Persian Empire, or Mauryan empires, all of which were built on cruder methods of war and economic exploitation, most of the methods which are faithfully simulated in Age of Empires 2. Therefore, to restrict the universal methods that lead to the rise and fall of kingdoms across the globe, across time, with the phrase colonialist logic, is to perpetuate the false notion that the very concept of war emerged from colonial Europe, which it did not. Therefore, this criticism is as presumptuous as it is flawed. The third parameter lies in the absence of blind spots, anxieties, and silences of post-colonial individuals. This refers to affording voices to the colonized, subjugated, marginalized, or subaltern in video games to a nuanced degree. Shovik sir, in his analysis of the RTS game Empire Total War, articulates this notion via an example. You can see the example.
Sorry to interrupt you. I'm just saying that you can go slower, really. We have time. So you have time to go slower. We have
fantastic. Okay, I'll go a little slower. The third parameter lies in the absence of blind spots, anxieties, and silences of post-colonial individuals. So this basically refers to affording voices to the colonized, marginalized, or individual subaltern in video games, to some degree that is considered nuanced. So Shovik sir, for example, in his analysis of Empire Total War, another RTS game, articulates this notion via an example. You can see it on the screen here. And the keyword here is basically protest, because through protest, conquered territories are given some semblance of a voice. Even if that voice may not be sort of nuanced enough, they are given a semblance of a voice. Of course, protest is only one method to articulate these subjective realities. There are, in truth, as many techniques of articulation as there are techniques of storytelling in video games. Let's say Symmetra in Valorant, Symmetra in Overwatch, Duleep Singh and Henry Green in Assassin's Creed Syndicate, ISL in FIFA 22 are just a few examples of the inclusion of specifically Indian, specifically individual, and specifically distinct voices in video games. Of course, how well they are represented is another question. FIFA, I'm looking at you. Anyway, Alexander Galloway, in his critique of civilization, states this important clause. He says that diachronic pluralities in everyday life are taken by the synchronic homogeneity of code. So similarly, while Age of Empires 2 affords Indians its own civilization, this does not equate to individual representation at all. There are no religious factions, no unique mutinies, no civil uprisings, no famous people that sort of separates India from the rest. For example, an Indian villager is, aside from a few statistical pluses and minuses, essentially the same as any other. They cook the same, they look the same, they collect food, wood, stone, and gold all the same. Any statistical difference are geared towards the aim of conquest, not towards individual self-actualization or any celebration of pluralistic identities. The representation of Indians in Age of Empires 2 then very much qualifies this category of post-colonial criticism, and the criticism is perfectly valid. The final parameter, which is the fourth parameter, is the existence of problematic winning conditions within the procedural rhetoric of the game, which directly propagates colonial history. So, for example, the conditions for Britain in empire requires the gamer to capture and hold 23 regions by the year 1750, which includes compulsorily Hindustan, Iceland, New France, and Leeward Islands. Now, aside from Iceland, all of these places were once colonized by English. So these are mirroring events in real colonialist history. Similarly, in Civilization 4, gamers have the quote-unquote ability to colonize Americas. French civilizations get bonuses for interacting with natives. The Dutch get bonuses for trade. The Spanish get extra gold for destroying native cities. All these game mechanics consciously incorporate past colonial identities within their procedural rhetoric, within their game's code. Excuse me, within their game's code, thus making it impossible for flexible counterfactual histories to occur without mods. You can see how Rebecca Mayer and Mitt Owens compare colonization with other installments of the Civilization series to raise an important point about counterfactual history. You can read it for yourself. Age of Empires 2, in this regard, is not like colonization and ETW. Civilizations can partner with what they want. Game scenarios and winning conditions are highly customizable rather than deterministic. In some of these scenarios, it is even possible to achieve victory without killing anyone through the constructing of a wonder. YouTuber T West has also won several campaigns using a completely pacifist walkthrough. Of course, one might argue, and I would agree, that the procedural rhetoric of EOE is to promote war, is to promote conquest. But as I mentioned above, this is not specifically part of a colonialist logic, only the general logic of war. Therefore, this criticism is also flawed. Right. I'm concluding now with this anecdote, because in Showixer's book, Video Games and Postcolonialism, when Showixer accounts for the gross misrepresentation of nuclear Gandhi in the Civilization series, I find the extrapolation interesting. There is a clause that says, while this might seem to be fun for some people, this treatment of the entire history of India's freedom movement and colonization is a violent erasure. I find this to be a curious assertion. Of course, several Indian gamers might not really care about the misrepresentation, but several Indian gamers might also be offended by it. Some others might find it amusing. Of course, Showixer is not aiming to be objective here. And this, in fact, is the primary takeaway from the anecdote. In the final analysis, all power dynamics emerge first and foremost from perception, whether they are substantiated by history, by, let's say, tangible facts of people being oppressed, or by misinformation is irrelevant. The very perceiving of any dominant submissive relation between two parties is a subjective process. So this is what makes the task of post-colonial studies particularly heavy. Much like other analysis of power, like Marxist or Foucauldian analysis of power, because the very mention of its school of thought is an invocation to its heritage, to its points of argument, and it lends credibility to the very existence of power relations. Therefore, the arguments themselves must strive to be relatively objective and watertight. Quite understandably, the identification of misrepresentation of Oriental spaces or peoples becomes a motive force for post-colonial criticism. Once misrepresentation sufficiently qualifies the point the fact that the video game was created by Western developers and sort of construct an argument from a post-colonial lens. However, upon examining the RTS parameters regarding Indians in specifically Age of Empires 2, I have found that there is sufficient reason to believe that they evade criticisms with respect to misinterpretation, with respect to misrepresentation. And it's not only misrepresentation, there are also valid counter arguments against two other parameters. These counter arguments may raise more questions than conclusions, of course, but one conclusion, at least that I find, is that Indians become an example for a future pathway post-colonial criticism can choose in order to separate themselves from, say, purely subjective accounts or op-eds. Misrepresentation, starting point of analysis. But the heritage of game studies have already identified other distinct parameters. So we would do well to employ them rigorously. This, in truth, will also make criticism clearer and more substantiated. So I think Jeffrey presented on Assassin's Creed, right, for instance. So let me just carry on this example very briefly. When it comes to a game like Assassin's Creed Syndicate, which is based in London, it's perfect Victorian English. So once we compare a game like Assassin's Creed Syndicate to other Assassin's Creed games, we can make the criticism, the misrepresentation criteria more valid. And from there on, of course, other parameters that are sort of more specific to the RPG genre, to the open world genre, can be found from Game Studies Lit Review and then alleged against Assassin's Creed. Final point, it is in employing these parameters and identifying newer ones that we will separate an academic, relatively objective and evidence-based form of discourse like game studies from arguments that are packaged out of subjective perception. Of course, even after all of this, there may remain some constraints to the post-colonial lens, but this does not mean that the lens must be done away with, only sharpened. This concludes my presentation on Age of Empires 2 on the post-colonial analysis of the representation of Indians. Again, I apologize if I was too quick. And yeah, over to the chair, over to Arithro.
Thank you for that lovely presentation. Now, we will be coming back to these papers with questions after the end of the session. For now, we will move on to the next paper by Prabhash, Ranjan Tripathy. Prabhash, are you there? You can set up your paper. Okay, so for the next paper, we are moving on to Prabhash Ranjan Tripathy for his paper, An Invisible Technician and the Unknown Child, Absences that Construct the Reality of Gaming in India. Prabhash Ranjan Tripathy, him, is a PhD candidate at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He works on early video game cultures in India. He is also interested in how to historically and philosophically understand games in culture. Over to you, Prabhash.
Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. And thank you to Shavik and rest of the DiGRA team for organizing this wonderful platform and so many nice papers. I'm the second last one, so I know it's with my presentation, it's going to reach one more step closer to the end. So it's a bit sad, but yeah, I'll go ahead with it anyway. So the paper is called An Invisible Technician and the Unknown Child, Fundamental Absences that Construct the Reality of Gaming in India. A rant to kick things off. Having committed myself to the task of being a scribe of the ludic in this country of ours, it would hardly come as a surprise to most of you that more than often I find myself troubled, wondering, even cursing myself for undertaking such a vocation. In my moments of frustrations, I ask, is it even worth writing a history of video games in India? Whom would this history serve? The state, the people, the nation, a discipline, all? Given the economic inequalities, digital divide, illiteracy, malnutrition, discrimination on the basis of caste, class, race, gender, religion, is it not absolutely ludicrous to think of writing anything about video games here? At this point, the happiness of game studies becomes unbearable. I think violently. Video games should be buried here like they were once upon a time in Mexico. This should be their ultimate resting ground. What saves or rescues video games from this timely and essential demise are the very inequalities that demand its annihilation. So far, it seems only the privileged can write this history. But does that necessarily mean it should be the history of the privileged? introduction. The paper would argue that the selection of game culture as an object of study often entails a methodological compulsion to focus exclusively on the game-gamer duo. This compulsive exclusive focus leads to production of homogeneous, compatible, convenient, and comparable accounts of game cultures with translatable linguistic differences and palatable local flavors. The temptation towards this methodological tendency / trap has serious political consequences. Not only does it fail to situate games in the socio-political space of the local, but also directs research away from engaging with the local specific absences or addressing specific forms of socio-historical inequalities, and thereby producing an inadequate representation of reality of gaming. The current paper, in calling absences fundamental, involves a thinking which treats absences as real as presences. This primarily to critique the dominance of excessive focus on presence. On one hand, the presentation seeks to explore the epistemological conditions that enable something or someone to register itself as a presence. Point and focus game culture. On the other, would try to articulate, suggest alternate ways to study games in culture. Section 2, excerpts from the lore of the disposable. Fridge, the invisible technician. In 2016, I conducted an interview with Mr. Garg, who runs a retail store in Happy Valley, Missouri, since 1980s. In our discussion about early arcade games in Missouri, he explained how it was impossible to get the standard arcade machines, as they would have to be imported and were expensive beyond imagination. Standard arcade machines back then, in the 90s, were priced $2,500 to $3,000 USD plus taxes. So instead, they developed a home brewing system, where the arcade cabinets were constructed by local carpenters and the arcade cabinet was assembled by a person called Fridge. He used to both assemble and repair the cabinet and was a highly valued craftsman. When I asked for his real name, Mr. Garg smiled and said, we just used to call him Fridge. He continued in an unsure manner. He was from Bengal, a very good electrician, but then something happened. People came looking for him because he had married a Muslim woman or something like that. And after that, he disappeared. The brief tale of Fridge and his contribution to the early gaming scenario, at least in Missouri, tells us not much about Fridge as a person, but does indicate that Fridge was a migrant laborer, worked in the unorganized sector, and was responsible for assembling the very machines that are of importance if one is to understand the history of video games in India. However, working in the unorganized sector means to inhabit a space of geographic and economic uncertainty. As Indranil Chakrabarty explains in his book, Invisible Labor, Support Service Labor in India's Information Technology Industry, that the cyber libertarian idea that links technology with development and growth often sidelines poverty and deprivation and fails to take into account how technology does not serve everyone equally. People like Fridge, though indispensable, are nonetheless disposable. They come and go. And as we have seen recently, they might even be forced to walk as they leave their temporary urban workspaces. Chotu, the unknown child. The video game parlors would often employ a child who would work as the in-house gamer, mechanic, manager, and security personnel. The teenager was described sometimes as the best gamer in the place, a teacher / sparring partner against whom kids practiced and learned, someone who set the standards of gameplay in the parlor, was well-versed in all the games, and had an intimate relationship with the machines. That is, he could open the machine and fix it in case it broke down, which it often did. The kid was the major point of contact for the rest of the kids who wanted to play. Few gamers I interviewed also talk of defeating him in a game as a transitional phase in their gaming life. However, no one knows their names, but they do remember their proficiency in games. For the child labor gamer, the video game parlor was not a place of pure play, as it was for the other kids who gathered in the gaming parlor. It was also a place of work. Learning how to play along with developing skills to fix the machines and identifying and preventing ways of cheating were part of his job description. Gagan Chinna, a Canadian scholar who also came and gave us a talk at DiGRA India, who studied 2 gaming lounges in Chandigarh, also encountered underage employees whose job profile included learning how to play, and the owner would often ask them to join him in playing games so that they could learn how to play, which would help them entertain the guests better. What happens to Chotus, Kalus, and other nameless? Can we imagine them as the first pro gamers in India? But wouldn't that entail a glorification of child labor? Alternatively, consider the following analysis. Chotu can be imagined as the boss in that arcade, who must be defeated in order to become a master. A word that was master as a word was often used by interviewees to define themselves or to explain how they felt. Chotu's position in the arcade can be seen as a repeated and gradual transition from being a playmate to a plaything for the visiting gamers, again and again, as they become masters and champions. Third section, construction of the object of study. The 2 figures discussed earlier are unique to the Indian gaming scene, and as can be observed, are fundamental for providing any account of gaming scene in India. However, the challenge is that within the discourse of game studies, game culture as an object of study is constructed in a manner which makes it difficult to talk about figures like Fridge and Chotu, as talking about them would inevitably lead to a discussion on child labor, labor trafficking, compulsive cosmopolitanism of the urban slum dweller, the inequalities produced by networks of globalization and their local variation, which would mean an inevitable movement, a movement which is also a threat to the unbearable happiness of the discipline, as it takes one away from the world of the gamer and his virtuosity, away from the game and its virtual beauty, away from both utopian and apocalyptic promise of the digital, to a place of exclusion, oppression, and labor. A quote from Adrian Shaw. Quote begins, "The term game culture arose around the same time as video game studies began to coalesce is interesting. It may indicate that regardless of the ivory tower rhetoric, game academics are defining their field of study as much as they are studying it. This is precisely why game studies should adopt a reflexivity of cultural studies in its analysis." End of quote, Adrian Shaw. Informed by Adrian Shaw's observation, I propose that we look at game culture as an object of study, that is, as a social technology designed to advance research rather than presenting it as self-explanatory. Game culture as a concrete object of study coincides with the establishment of game studies as a discipline, which initially presented itself as a discipline solely dedicated to the study of video games, but has now claims to the study of games in general, with specialization in video games. Creation of objects of study is not uncommon within academic disciplines. For example, disciplines of sports science and tourism studies also deploy the same technique to create objects of study like sports culture, sports community, tourist communities, etc. Game studies is a specialized discipline. One of the many features of a specialized discipline is that they harness quantitative skills and generate research that smoothly carries over to the employment market, both in the private and public sectors. Quoting Chris Rogic, game studies as a specialized discipline is similarly entrusted with the generation of data demanded by both the industry and the state. As an object of study, game culture is expected to fulfill the purpose, that is, production of research that enhances cultural literacy to aid market research. And it is precisely for this reason that the problem raised by Shaw on the treatment of game culture as separate from mainstream culture are still unanswered. However, one finds it difficult to completely agree with Shaw when she suggests that the reason behind this treatment of game culture in the academy is that the scholars write from the inside and identify as gamers. The insistence on maintaining game culture as an object of study rather than studying video games in culture is not merely because the scholars identify as gamers, but also because the discipline wants to produce specialized knowledge that is deemed valuable by employers both in the state and the industry. The study of gaming scene within this specialized schema unavoidably demands an exclusive focus on game gamer. The specialized schema is especially problematic when applied to places like India, where video games appeared rather late and in a concentrated fashion. And the study of games came even later. As of now, there is not a single game studies department. First, on a lighter note, the researcher working in the global south is not the beneficiary of the intentions, that is, of employment, carried by the specialized approach. On a serious note, the specialized study of game culture, with its obsessive exclusive focus on game-gamer duo, depoliticizes the space and creates research akin to what James Ferguson has termed anti-politics machine. That is, it provides a formalistic and technical understanding of complex social problems, which are locally located. Erasures and absences become inevitable within such a schema. In showing fidelity to a non-beneficiary disciplinary prescription, the researcher from the global south is successfully transformed into a local informant position, where he or she produces translatable and compatible account of the discipline, but fails to establish games as a site to think and address social problems that surround him or her. Therefore, it becomes increasingly important that we move away from the specialized schema and study games and culture more reflexively and with more courage. Indiscipline is the only discipline that keeps humanities alive and relevant. Next section, the problem of newness. There is a consensus among scholars regarding alleged newness of video games. However, while one needs to acknowledge the newness of modern digital computational technology, one needs to be wary of placing games and sports as something that predate computer games, and hence are to be treated as separate categories. This rhetorical move is not only to establish the newness of the video game, but the ancientness of sports and the biological origins of games and play. I would like to suggest that in this strict categorization lies the politics of the discourse. By creating convenient, non-overlapping categories of sports, games, play, and video games, it establishes a new epistemology, which is dependent on a hierarchy, where play is transcendental, biological and essential, sport is ancient, serious, meaningful, and ideological, games are casual, ancient, essential, and educative, video games are the new. Thus, by attaching values to various ludic structures, this epistemology normalizes the work-play divide of the post-industrial society, and at the same time, it globalizes it. What I mean by this is that it is imperative that one does not ascribe to the idea that video games are a rupture in the history of the ludic, and understand that video games are valuable as the new, only and only when the new is thought of as a movement that provides an opportunity, a lens to review, revisit, rewrite the past. Last section, calming down. The idea behind this paper was to remove the hurdles that restrict games from becoming spaces to think about our lived social reality, and to suggest that as research is an act of courage, and by choosing games as our site of inquiry, we have already shown a lot of it, but still we need more courage in our choices, topics, analysis, and methods. Now, I would like to return to the unbearable happiness of game studies again. Thank you.
Thank you, Prabhash, for such a lovely talk. We'll come back again after the session for the question answers. For now, we will be moving on to our probably last paper of this presentation by Samya. Samya, would you just set up? Meanwhile, so Brata Roy will be talking on no racism. That's pretty sus, or is it? A study of identity and scope for conflict in the gaming space of Among Us. Brata Roy, him, is a PhD student in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences in IIT Jodhpur. His interests and involvements lie in and around literary studies, digital humanities, remediation, pedagogy, and promoting access via networks. Over to you, Shammo.
Yeah. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much, Aritro, for that lovely introduction. I would like to say a big hello to everyone who's here, and I would also like to acknowledge before starting that it's a great thing for me to speak here at this event, and I would like to also congratulate all of those speakers who have spoken before me, and it has been a fantastic listening experience. Okay, so this is a kind of I would say this is a fun idea, a fun experiment uh, that I went through. So I was playing Among Us with my friends and had this kind of realization that hang on, something seems different here, doesn't it? And I thought of going a little bit deeper into the dynamics of the same. So let's get started. So my topic is called No Racism. That's pretty sus, or is it? A study of identity and scope for conflict in the gaming space of Among Us. Now, if you are not familiar, let me just quickly inform that the word sus means suspicious or something to be suspected. That it's something that was made popular after Among Us reached immense popularity last year. So yeah, just okay, so let's get started. Last year, when I was battling Corona and a slight drizzle of existential uncut dread, is when I resorted to Among Us, this quirky little game, as this space of in maintaining informal contact with my friends and other peers, to be very honest, because formal channels of contact for me at that point, I was finishing my masters. There was the emails and everything, and the class conversations, those were happening. But what about the informal conversations? What about the night walks that I was missing out on? What about the evening chai sessions? So Among Us was a rather, it created a very interesting rhetorical exigency, if I'm allowed to use this weird little term, a very interesting rhetorical exigency to bring forth the informal conversations into the picture. And I didn't think that this would play this function, to be very honest. Now, starting off with this, this curious quote by Jonas Hyder Smith, The Problem of Other Players in Game Cooperation as Collective Action. It says, in multiplayer games, the problem, of course, is often the other players. Now, but what happens if you need the other players in the multiplayer gaming space to survive? Now, I understand that that is the case with a lot of other role-playing games and MMORPGs. But I find that in Among Us, the function of communication becomes fundamentally different in the sense that I will elaborate. That going into conflict becomes absolutely opposite of what you would want. And hence, the materialization of conflict changes fundamentally. When I was starting to play this game, not talking about when I was playing with my friends, but when I was playing with strangers online, the open public forums, I went into those forums with an expectation of it to be extremely racist and people will be raging. Now, remember that this was the first time that I was playing the game. I was not aware of the features. I wasn't aware of any of the features in the game. I really expected people to do rage quits, like the very illustrative picture that I have presented. I believe you can relate. I expected a very racially charged, is the word that I also used in my abstract, racially charged atmosphere, and also so people being very angry, people being very serious, etc., etc., etc. Now, my understanding, and as I will elaborate also in the brief literature that I have studied, the most understanding of communication in the online gaming space comes from, for me personally, I would say, from games like Counter-Strike, PUBG, Valorant, etc., etc. which features a very interesting thing called the in-game voice chat. I will come to that a little bit later. So my expectation, if you will, came from that context, but it was very different here. Moving on. But as the slide says, boy, was I wrong. And next, this kind of me being wrong and me being very pleasantly surprised about this rather quirky phenomena led me to inquire about the lack of the so-called racially charged atmosphere. Now, these are the few conversations that helped me understand and identify a sort of theoretically pinpoint the discussion that was circling in the back of my head. The first point that I would like to bring to the picture here is the conversation regarding identity, which Lisa Nakamura talks about at the turn of the millennium in her famous works, All Look Same and Passing on the Internet. I'm sorry, I haven't written all the names of the papers rather elaborately in the slides because it would be a lot of textual information. But if anyone is interested, I'm more than happy to provide the readings. So that's it really. Nakamura comes up with a very interesting proposition in her article where she says in the context of identity tourism that anyone can be a dog on the internet without the others realizing. It is an exaggeration saying that without something that I call markers of identity later in the paper, one cannot possibly know who is the person behind the avatar. Because anyone can be anyone and anyone can be pretending to be anyone. So there is that performative aspect of play, if you will. That is the first point, the point of identity. The second point that I found interesting was the conversations regarding typology in this paper by Wright, Boria, and Breidenbach in 2002, who studies Counter-Strike. Obviously, it was written in 2002, and it is very well situated in the time that the study was done. And they categorize it into 5 general categories, in-game communication into 5 general categories. Number 1, creative game talk. Number 2, game conflict talk. Number 3, insult or distancing talk. Number 4, performance talk. And number 5 is game technical or external talk. Now, I'll elaborate very briefly on what these mean. Creative game talk is just them talking about skills and certain qualities and other stuff, or it can also mean talking about or joking about certain aspects of the game, humor, etc., etc. Second point, which happens to be my focal point in this conversation right here, is the game conflict talk, is that when you are in conflict with a teammate or with someone else, so how do you resolve that conflict? So that is the second part. The third, which emerges out of the second format, is the insult or the distancing talk, where you insult someone because you are angry or you want to distance themselves because of something that has gone wrong. The fourth is the performance talk, which talks about in-game play, changing your weapon or tactical conversation, etc., etc. 5 is game technical or external talk. For example, if someone is having a problem with the internet connection or someone has to go away from this playing, they have to go away from the keyboard, etc., etc. This typology and Nakamura's postulations helps me further build on, which I will talk about in the later slides. But before that, it is also important to contextualize these 2 postulations. Wilkund in 2005 talks about in-game genres relying heavily on atmosphere and game character personalities, such as online role-playing games. This type of out-of-character communication is often discouraged since it has a negative effect on the atmosphere and the flow of play. Now, this becomes very important when we talk about voice conversation in Among Us, not so much about the text conversation in Among Us. Because when we friends used to play the game, even when we were on voice chat, doing the so-called relax, winding up after a day of tireless staring in front of the void that is the laptop screen. So that is supposed to be relaxation, but that relaxation also had an element of the performative, so as to speak, that even when someone has killed the other in the game, there was this consensual silence about it, and the silence was maintained. And I should also point out that there were no pre-existing rules set that you should not speak about it, or but everyone understood that that is what the protocol is. And hence it is not just about out of character communication is discouraged, but it affects the logic of gameplay in itself. And last but not the least comes the idea of deceit. In a very interesting paper that I found called Contextualizing Deceit in Games by Duarte in 2017, it says, deceit is therefore a persuasive strategy, which, although seen as unpopular by mainstream media, is relevant in modern video games market, being often utilized not only as a mean to trick players, but also as an empowerment mechanism as far as their gameplay options are concerned. Now, it is very important to note that the perspective in which deceit is being talked about here by Duarte is fundamentally different than what I understand as lying and deceit in the context of Promax. Here, deceit is being talked about from the perspective of the maker of the game, and how they employ certain persuasive strategies in order to keep the player engaged in the act of gaming. That may be via loot boxes, that may be via certain competitions which give apparent discounts, and you can unlock a shiny new banana skinned pistol or something, I don't know. But here, deceit is not just a persuasive strategy. Deceit becomes fundamental to the act of play, because otherwise the play doesn't happen, the play falls apart. And finally, concluding the set of conversations with the element of deduction in the paper by Apirath Limani in 2020, where the conversation is, the popularity partly stems from its appeal to human intuitive mechanism of finding out who belongs to our side, whom we should trust, and who lies to us. The discussion can resemble a non-traditional courtroom where everybody can simultaneously be the prosecutor, defendant, lawyer, detective, witness, and judge at the same time. Now, what does this mean, that finding out who belongs to our side? Is this a trial? Is this a trial in the room of court? Not necessarily as seriously as we may point out, but I have experienced this personally in saying that while playing the game, if you manage to lie, kill, and dupe your best friend, and after that session of the game, when we reflect on the game session with a lot of sarcasm, wit, and a sense of temporary bravado, the person who has lost feels betrayed and says, "Oh, you have betrayed my trust." Although in a very playful and funny manner, nonetheless, it is present. Moving on from this to build towards building my framework of analyzing communication and one specific sect of communication in Among Us. The number one part, as I pointed out, is the element of deceit, performance, and identity, and how they're intrinsically connected. As pointed out by Duarte, Max, and Nakamura. The second one is typology. The paper is written by 3 people, including Bridenbach. I use the typology to kind of come up with my own typology in Among Us communication about creative performance coupled with conflict and insult. But there is one fundamental caveat which I will point out right now. What will that caveat be? I am not interested. I was talking about till this point about communication, speaking with friends. But what happens when you enter the gaming space in a public platform where you don't know who you are playing with? Hence, because Among Us doesn't have an in-game voice chat, the only point of communication in the game is the textual mode of communication in the chat. But that chat doesn't appear always. It only appears when there is some there are some suspicious activities detected and someone calls an emergency meeting, and that chat, the so-called chat, is time bound. It's not unlimited. So when conversation is time bound and when you're forced to be minimalistic in nature in your conversations, what kind of conflict can possibly emerge in such a social, virtual, whatever you want to call it, scenario? Now, my data, so as to speak, comes from my experience and interviews of my friends who I played with. And this is where I draw my conclusion from. And obviously, my findings are situated very much so in my lived experience. And as Poonamdi and Zahra were also talking about in today's keynote, that there is not to draw a singularity. It will and should change from cultural context to context. Okay, number one, lack of markers of identity. And this is where I draw my conclusion from. And number two, the lack of a competitive element. These are not definitive answers, but more of a question, because in my abstract, I also write at the very end that I try to reach an, how should I put it, an elusive conclusion, if you will. Before discussing the data that emerged out of my experience and also the interviews that I took, albeit the data set being very small, nevertheless, is something that I understand as a lack of markers of identity. Now, before proceeding to describe what these markers of identity mean, I would like to elaborate a little bit. I have 4 minutes, I guess, with me on how I came to this using this theoretical understanding of the marker. I was made aware of this thing called generic markers when I was introduced to the field of comparative literature. Now, generic markers are certain elements in a textual tradition, literary textual tradition, which help determine one literary form from the other. Let's take the sonnet for the example. It has 14 lines. It can be about love. The word can is very important, or it can be about politics as well. If we look at Milton, it may have a rhyme scheme. It may not have a rhyme scheme. So these are the few markers that connote whether a sonnet is a sonnet or whether a sonnet is not a sonnet. But as we have seen from Giacomo dell'Antino in Italy, before even Petrarch, to someone like Rainer Maria Rilke or Gerard Manley Hopkins, the idea of the sonnet has changed, but we still call it a sonnet. Hence, if we decontextualize the idea of the generic marker and place it in the context of someone's identity. So what are these markers of identity? The visual, which is the video, of course. If we remove the video, then what comes? The audio, the voice. You may identify the accent of the person and you may understand where the person is from. Number three is written words, certain ways the sentences are constructed, certain words that are used. And the person with the same lived experience might understand that if language is being used in a certain way in textual communication, it might possibly mean that this person is from a particular space. And it is also based on stereotypes, obviously, needless to say. Now, when you remove voice, video, and you also make the textual communication time bound, where does the conflict come from? Because the points of conflict is constantly being eliminated one after the other. Hence, the idea of racism, vitriol, violence does not emerge because the markers of identity are absent in communication. The exigency, the rhetorical exigency, emerges only out of the gamic condition, and that only. And it doesn't emerge, the rage isn't fueled by anything else. Even the textual chat is time bound. And also it is important to note, as one of my respondents pointed out, that if you become hostile, you raise up the crisis of being kicked out. Doesn't matter if you win or lose, if that is detrimental to the gameplay or not, but you can be kicked out if you behave in a hostile manner. So it is directly connected to the idea of being in the game itself, that hostility is not what is required for the game to progress. And the second part is that it is not competitive, it does not have a leaderboard, etc., etc., etc. Now, once again, this understanding of Among Us is based on when I played 1 year ago, and not how Among Us is at this moment, because I haven't had a chance to go back to it in the recent times, because the games are always updated. So is it a utopia of non-conflict then? No, because there are still stereotypes, and this image that I found on the internet is very telling of that. Because it says that the black one is the smart one usually, brown one says that his color was stolen, and the yellow one is the forgettable one. Now, yes, this would be going too far and saying that because colored bodies of brown and yellow are connected with the Orient, and hence these colors of the body or the colors of the avatar are intrinsically connected to those avatars which are chosen by people who A, wish to be forgotten, or two, they chose that color because there was no other color to choose, because it is a color which is residual, so as to speak. It is the leftover color. And when you say that the black is the so-called smart and the white is the so-called detective, it raises questions about identity tourism and racial passing, as pointed out by Elisa Nakamura. So conflict can also emerge from these understandings of color, avatar, etc., etc. But also on the usernames, on what username one has. US Navy's Twitch account faced heavy criticism during a session of Among Us, where they used offensive and racially insensitive names as Nagasaki, Japan 1945, and the gamer word, which is used to replace the N word online. So conflict can very much happen. But my point is, why is it apparently less than other gaming spaces, other multiplayer spaces? And perhaps this may be one of the reasons. And this is where I stop and I'm a head out. Thank you so much for listening to me. This has been a pleasure and an honor. And this is my email address if you wish to get in touch. It's been a pleasure. So yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
We could have ended with the Among Us theme there. Thanks for such a wonderful talk and such a suspicious talk. Thank you, everyone. All of those who are present, who presented in this panel. Lovely presentation. We will. Okay, so we will be moving on towards question answers. We will be taking questions in the chat box. You can write your questions and comments in the chat box. And if you want, you can also use the raise hand button, and then you can unmute yourself and talk. I'll check the chat box. We have some questions here. Okay. So the first question for Samya by Nini is, Call Me Kevin regularly went out of character in playing Among Us. He basically made friends with everyone, and when he was imposter, vented in front of them as a sign of trust. This meant that people did not vote for him, and he eventually won. Question: is there a new play to be found in breaking the rules and the atmosphere of the game?
Just give me a moment. I'm trying to pull up a quote to answer this question. Just a minute. Please allow me to indulge. All right. So in this, in the paper that I was talking about, am I muted? No, no. So this paper is called Creative Player Actions in FPS Online Video Games Playing Counter-Strike. It came out in 2002 by Wright, Boria, and Bridenbach. It has a very interesting quote that play is not just within quotes playing the game, but within quotes playing with the rules of the game. So yeah, I very much agree with your proposition that once again, let me read Neil's question again. That is there a new play to be found in breaking the rules of the atmosphere of the game? Definitely so. Otherwise, my entire experience of playing Cricket 7 and GTA Bangla Vice City would be null and void. So yeah, that is my answer to your question.
Thank you. Another question by Hario. I have a question for Shammo. Do you draw a comparison between the real world's often covert racism with Among Us's insidious identity?
Would I, yeah, this is an interesting question, but I would rather ask you to elaborate a little bit on what do you mean by insidious identity? Could you elaborate a tiny little bit so as to give me a pointer as to in which direction you're asking the question from?
If you can, yeah, I am unmuting you.
Okay, hello, Samuel. So what I mean by this, so I think there's a comparison between how, because you mentioned racism in the title of your presentation.
Yes.
So in the sense that people would not be overtly racist, but would either again having a racist attitude behind closed door, or even worse, planning something bad. So in the same way with you know, how the people who become the suspect works in the game. So yeah. I think that's how I can explain with the insidious identity. So they will not show that they are racist, but they are, and they're trying to hide it, they're trying to blend it, etc. And how do you draw that phenomena?
I absolutely agree with your proposition, and now I can answer your question that yes, I think that I would draw a comparison of real world overt racism with Among Us's insidious identity. I would also refer to this. There is a comedy sketch by this, if I am not wrong, this African comic who talks about racism in Britain as compared to racism in Africa. It is a very famous comedy sketch. If I find the link, I will share in the chat. And he says that British racism is used to be the top-notch racism, but it is not the top-notch racism anymore. That it is very soft and subtle, whereas African racism during the apartheid reign was very out there. So I absolutely agree with your idea of covert racism and insidious identity. And I think that in the gaming space of Among Us, is that it's not that people are not racist there. It is just that people can't afford to show that they're racist because of the reasons that I talked about. So yeah.
Thank you, if that answers your question. Okay, so I have a question for Prabhash from Shobik sir. Shobik sir, if you can unmute and ask.
Yes, Prabhash, that was a fascinating presentation, as everyone has said. I wanted to take us back to a conversation which we had on WhatsApp a long while ago about kind of your work on the, gaming parlors than the chotus, but in relation to caste, in relation to issues of caste, which we have discussed yesterday about kind of elitism, etc. But then when we are talking about the chotus, what you talk, who are assisting in the games, but who are also like master games, game players in their own right. But then they're coming from different disadvantaged kind of groups, perhaps. And you said that you were thinking about kind of the caste kind of divisions, the issues, and you also mentioned some locations in Delhi where the gaming parlors were, which again were connected to. So I'm now thinking, I mean, basically when you said something like the game versus the gamer binary is depoliticized, uh, and in your talk, you kind of make it clear that how it cannot be depoliticized. I was wondering through your own fieldwork and research and other kind of, your recent investigations, if you could maybe lead us towards that discussion of, caste and of course class and position.
Thank you, Shavik, for that wonderful question. There's a lot to unpack. I have to, okay. So, okay, I'll just start and then see where it goes, okay? So, yeah, what I realized was that initially during my MPhil, this work, this field work is related to my MPhil, and Shavik has also kindly read it and gave me some really nice inputs about it. So during that field work, I was kind of focusing because I was going to the parlor and talking to the gamers, and they were very and then I was reading other folks who were working on fighting game communities in Hong Kong. There's one essay in Game Studies Journal by one person, Benjamin something, on King of Fighters and Street Fighter in Hong Kong. And then I read Todd Harper, then I read Goto Jones, and another Japanese scholar. I'm missing the name right now. But what I realized was the things that I was observing, that people were talking a certain way about themselves as martial artists, playing fighting games, and the culture was similar. The local languages were translated the moves into local languages, and the person from Hong Kong was also saying that in Hong Kong it was also translated. So I was realizing that all four of us, all four researchers in different places studying fighting game communities, we set out to talk about something specific about that fighting game community out there, but we ended up saying the same stuff, and that kind of bothered me. I was like, why couldn't we capture anything that would localize the whole thing, except for linguistic differences, as I say, like translatable material, which is just going to feed. And then I realized that there's a methodological problem here, that if we focus only on the gamer duo and do a study of game cultures, then there is a problem. And then I kind of started an investigation into why couldn't I talk about caste? Why couldn't I talk about these invisibilities? And I think that is the problem of game culture as a object of study has been constructed. Like if you have to talk about like the thing about Delhi and these video game parlors. In Delhi, if you cartographically see, Delhi is divided. Certain areas in East Delhi are divided according to caste demographics. Tirlokpuri, Kondli, and Kalyanpuri, and all these places are basically have other names. They are called like Kondli is basically Ambedkar colony. In the local lingo, it is a slur is used. I'll say it. I'm sorry. Chamar colony, and Tirlokpuri is called Bhangi colony, which is for scavengers. And there were video game parlors here. But in order to talk about it, nobody is gonna, if I talk to the gamer and the game and do not consider this geographical divide and do not consider the caste thing from a larger perspective, like from how caste how caste in itself has invades all forms of analysis, and also the idea of technological Indian and the ludic Indian. If video games are a point where the ludic Indian meets the technological Indian, and that is the nexus, then the technological Indian and the ludic Indian both have caste identities. So how do we do it? So I thought we have to look at history in a different way, and we would have to consider caste from the very beginning rather than approaching people in the video game parlors and just talking to them. That is a very important thing to do. But then we have to talk about something else. Like the person who was talking about Hong Kong and video game parlors, he talked about an appropriation of Japanese video games by Hong Kong. But he couldn't reflect on the fact that the Hong Kong had a supremacy on Asian masculinity due to the Kung Fu movies, and it was Japanese video games that were replacing that masculinity. So it was a redoing of that masculinity to make Japanese masculinity again Hong Kong. And then when Todd Harper talks about Chinatown and the arcade culture there, he forgets to talk about Chinatown as a space and its historical value as an extremely exotic racialized space for Asians in America. So I think we have to we have to be more courageous in to open up and not be scared to go into disciplines which probably might make us uncomfortable. So I think that covers it. So it's like I'm trying to do all that in my PhD work, which I'm starting to submit in some time. So yeah.
Prabhash, fascinating. But if I might just tag along one more point to this, we were discussing it ourselves just now, which is that when we are talking about elitism and video games being an elite medium, what you have talked about in terms of the chotus, I mean, I'm just using this term from your, dissertation, but what Gagan Chinna has talked about in his own, talk and his own, they're different, but we are looking at kind of perhaps groups of people or people who might not be considered elite as such, but who are participating in this as part of their quotidian activities. Really, it's just that we don't research or we don't kind of think of, we don't really want to even look at what they're doing. Really. But it's they're playing these games and they're kind of but it's not kind of reflecting in the discourses of game studies or I don't know, game cultures.
Yeah, sure. That's what's happening in every place, right, Shavik? Like in India, when we talk about the technological aspirations, we have to consider the organized sector and the unorganized sector in the Indian economy. The technological imagination and even if there is a cyborgian subjectivity, it is different in both the sectors, and therefore it needs to be analyzed from a completely different, a new approach. And as far as chotus are concerned, I consider them to be objects of that space. I do not consider them to be participating in gameplay, because on one hand, they do not choose the games that they want to play. We chose the games we wanted to play. They are in-house gamers who are also approaching the gameplay as work. They are never going to transit to something else. And because I met one of these guys, Akash, who was working in hijinks at that point. He had like grown up and now he was working in a better arcade or something. And he said that I worked for a while in an arcade in Delhi, not in Dehradun, small arcade, small place. We used to go there. And he didn't like those games at all. So, and he said that I didn't have any choice but to play them and be good at them as well at the same time. So, so one needs to ask if someone can play minus work.
Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for that answer. Xenia has asked for a comment and question for Prabhash. Xenia, if you can unmuting you, you can.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think you can hear me now, right?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Thank you to everyone for your talks and for the important work that you do, and also to Prabhash, because I was intrigued on different levels about what you do and what you said. The comment would be related to the importance of this context-specific affordances and tech availability related issues in India. So it is very, very relevant and interesting and important to research what is happening in games, to research the colonial attitude and so on. Everything we heard in this conference a lot. I think that is, again, super relevant and interesting, but also I think we need to keep in mind when talking about India and games as related to India, gaming cultures, we need to take the specifics into account. As a person who talks about games and India in a broader sense at an international level a lot, I mean, really always experience that while my colleagues might be aware that there are specifics, they would not know anything about the details of these specifics. And of course, how would they? So if work is coming up on this by you, Prabhash, or by anyone, I would strongly encourage you to publish that, to make to somehow get our international colleagues a picture of how game studies in India as well, of course, develops within these specifics. And that would be the comment, and the question would be about your data, please. So I understand you have been doing fieldwork in all kind of gaming parlors and the context of gaming parlors, and you're writing a PhD. And I was wondering, did you do any kind of work, data gathering work, basically beyond gaming parlors?
Thank you for that question, that comment. And I mean, I am, like constantly, because I'm right now in my PhD, so papers are gonna come out slowly because it's like hard deadlines that we have to meet right now, and 2 years pandemic, things are pretty problematic. Now we can't, I mean, like there were paper deadlines and we couldn't commit to it, but of course I would do that. So thank you for that. And as far as I conducted research, I mean, like fieldwork in Mussoorie and Delhi, both the places, and on basically video game parlors. Other data ethnographic interviews that I wanted to conduct for my fieldwork for my PhD, I mean, they have been kind of delayed, but I am gonna start collecting a couple of things on. I want to talk to a few people about the 8-bit console, because the 8-bit console was something which was available, NES clone. I have a couple of people in mind whom I wanted to converse about. And then there were these old brick games, like there was this handheld device that we used to get and people used to play. So basically, I mean, how am I dividing my chapters is basically first kind of I'm looking at a space and a particular game, and so the machine and the game. That's the kind of division that I'm going for. So console. When I talk about console, I talk about Mario, because Mario is pretty popular was pretty popular in India. So that's my second focus. Third one is on the brick game. Rest is going to be the historical, how do we locate video games in the history of the ludic in India. And there the colonial connection that you talked about is going to come, because there is a huge impact on, I mean, like if you look at the early history of colonialism and games, how games were introduced to India as a pedagogical device in order to train the savage, as the saying goes, and how it was taken over by the Indians themselves, but sports as a thing which was devised in the metropole and then sent to the colonies in order to, as a disciplinary technique. how that goes on and how we are basically transiting to a more controlled society. That's the outline, kind of. That's how I'm thinking. Did I answer your question, or did I just say about? Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the answers, Prabhash. We'll move on to, okay, so James Bailey has a couple of questions for Neil. Thank you for the paper. These might be too big to answer immediately, but I'd be interested in any thoughts. So Neil, the questions are, firstly, one thing that's brought up regarding strategy games and colonialism is landscape. Games like Age of Empires 2 start with mostly empty landscape with wild wandering ships, sheep, etc., which I have seen people argue encoded ideas of virgin land from, for example, the European conquest of the USA, and thus implicitly erases native peoples. Do you have any thoughts on that regarding AOE2's mechanics and the game's lack of settled landscapes? Neil, would you take both the questions?
I'll answer the question and I'll
Okay,
read out the second question as well. Thank you for the question, James. Hope everything's well on that side. Games like AOE2 start with mostly empty landscape, wild wandering sheep. Of course, this is like a reference to the Dark Age when the game begins and there are just deer and boar and sheep roaming around. Of course, it does on the one hand encode ideas of virgin lands, how Europeans viewed Oriental lands as ones ripe for conquest. It also, I would say, also mirrors like when Genghis Khan conquered the entire Persian territory, or when Alexander the Great did the same thing. The mechanics are basically the same, where they viewed these areas as virgin lands ripe for conquest, and they did that. What would separate, let's say, something like that to something like colonialism is economics. If you consider Marx a reliable source, then Marx, I think, in 2 articles on British rule in India, basically said that capitalism is like led to colonialism because they wanted more markets and they came here and they did colonization and blah, blah, blah. The only extent that you see of an economic exploitation in Age of Empires is your sort of traditional loot and plunder techniques. So you take over the other civilization and then you loot and plunder the gold that the gold stones and the stones and the good lines and things like that. So that is again your rather traditional loot and plunder structures. There are no proper structures that say, okay, I have conquered you now. Your villagers will produce goods and services and give like a kind of give a portion of that to me, and we will sell it in our areas. So those things require a little more. They need to be there to be analyzed. The other question is whether you think nationalism is a more interesting line of analysis than colonialism regarding AOE2's ahistorical elements. The RTS genre in some ways creates a perfected total control state for the player, which states being perfectly homogeneous and having permanently opposed interests. Do you have any thoughts on how nationalism and statism intersect with the Indian presentation in AOE2? That's actually a very good point. I do think that nationalism is a great lens to explore AOE2 through. One problem, I think that nationalism in the context of war is pretty much the perfect way to analyze Age of Empires, because one thing that one realizes that in pro players playing or low elo legends is that you already know that if you tell a villager to move there, they will move there. There's not going to be any protest over there. And similarly, if you tell an entire battalion of soldiers to just go and die for the sake of creating a diversion through which you can sneak in through the other areas, they will do that, no questions asked. So in the context of war, it will give the gamer much more disregard for human life because they have total control, unquestionable control. And in the context of war, they will sort of create wars for the uber aim of conquest. There are other more specific mechanisms of nationalism, like controlling of discourse and like controlling of media. Like I think Noam Chomsky says that when for America to create like a sense of nationality, they had to antagonize the USSR. Things like that. So things like that, there is no real data for. There is no output for sort of civil discourse or how media is controlled to explore those aspects of nationalism. But nationalism in the context of war, I think, is a very great way to explore this issue. Neil, thanks for the paper. This is Prabhash. Neil, thanks for the paper. Did you look at imperialism and its difference from and connections to colonialism? I did. The general consensus is that imperialism led to colonialism, of course. So colonialism is like a more upgraded form of your natural forms of conquest and control. Earlier forms of having an empire, like your Roman Empire or anything like that, were more to do with cruder forms of conquest and control and looting and plundering and destroy all the masjids or destroy all the mandirs, things like that. Colonialism, what made colonialism different was that it caused huge cultural changes. And it caused a huge, like Anya Lumba says, a huge economic relationship between the colonizer and the colonized, where there is a natural flow of human and natural resources between the two. So yeah, those were the economic and cultural and discursive elements where, the idea of the white man's burden, the idea that, like how Lord Macaulay says that one shelf, I'm paraphrasing here, one shelf in a good English and European library is much better than all the books in Asia, Africa, and things like that. So you're creating a discourse that says that you're creating a discourse which is positing a hegemony. So things like that, discursive control, economic control, and what's the third one? Cultural influences. Those are more to do with colonialism.
Thank you, Neil, for such brilliant answers. Do we have any other questions? We still have a bit of time. Okay, so, and does anybody have any other question?
If not, then we could just start the open lobby and have a discussion.